Hello everyone! Today we're reading Little House in the Big Woods, Chapter 8, Part 1. Today is going to be Part 1 of 2 for Chapter 8. Today we have 3 vocab words. The first one being something called hasty pudding. Hasty pudding. It looks kind of like applesauce, kind of like that color and like that texture. It's not like the chocolate pudding we have today. Like they didn't have that back then. And this hasty pudding was made with cornmeal. So it was not like the pudding we have now by any means, but just a yummy little pudding. Okay. The second vocab word is called petticoats. What do you think that means? Petticoats is something that women put under their dresses to make them big. They're layers of material. So, like if a woman gets married and she wants a big dress, like when I got married, I had a big petticoat on underneath. And that's just something, let me try to do it here. There are things like this that go, there you go. Things like this that go underneath your dress. So you just put your regular dress on top of it, and then these go underneath and they make your dress big and full. So now we have all this nice plastic and all these nice things to keep them up. Like these are all made with plastic. Like it has material on top, but plastic boning, like plastic rods that go down to keep it shape. Well, back then, their petticoats didn't have any of that. So instead of just having one nice big petticoat like this to where it's light and it doesn't weigh very much, they had 4 petticoats on. They would put layers and layers and layers of material to make their dresses really big. They were really fun and swishy, but they were also very heavy, and they can get very warm when they're dancing around. So there was definitely some pros and cons, but it was the style. You had to have big petticoats to go with your dress, to go with your nice dresses. The last thing I want to talk about, your third vocab word, is a corset. So you might know a little bit about corsets. You know, you might have seen something about them, but I just wanted to explain a little bit because it's kind of a weird thing because we don't have them very much unless you're wearing a fancy ball gown or dress. So a corset is a type of restraining. No, it's an undergarment that goes underneath your dress. And if you look here at this picture of this very nice dress, you'll notice, oh, she's have puffy sleeves and a puffy bottom of the skirt, but her waist is very tiny. And the clothing is structured to be very tiny around her waist. And that was made possible by a corset. So this one's a really pretty one, but this just shows the back. So what you would do is a woman would put that on and she'd say, okay, lace me up. So what they do is they pull the laces like how you pull your tennis shoe laces. They pull the laces and pull them and pull them and pull them and pull them. And then suddenly it starts sucking you in. It sucks you in so much, and if you're not careful, it's very unhealthy for you because you should never have something sucked in all the time. But that was the style. To wear the fancy dress like that, you had to wear the fancy corset. So in today's chapter, it talks about the corset and it talks about the petticoats because there's going to be the dance, there's going to be the party. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up about what those things were. All right, so don't forget to have your notes out if you need to, because you'll need at least 4 notes on this section. Okay, Chapter 8, Dance at Grandpa's. Something jigging. Monday morning, everybody got up early, in a hurry to get started to Grandpa's. Pa wanted to be there to help with the work of gathering and boiling the sap. Ma would help Grandma and the aunts make good things to eat for all the people who were coming to the dance. Breakfast was eaten and the dishes washed and the beds made by lamplight. Pa packed his fiddle carefully in its box and put it in the big sled that was already waiting at the gate. The air was cold and frosty, and the light was gray when Laura and Mary and Ma with baby Carrie were tucked in snug and warm under the robes on the straw in the bottom of the sled. The horses shook their heads and pranced, making the sleigh bells ring merrily, and away they went on the road through the big woods to Grandpa's. The snow was damp and smooth in the road, so the sled slipped quickly over it, and the big trees seemed to be hurrying by on either side. After a while there was sunshine in the woods, and the air sparkled. The long streaks of yellow light lay between the shadows of the tree trunks, and the snow was colored faintly pink. All the shadows were thin and blue, and every little curve of snowdrifts and every little track in the snow had a shadow. Pa showed Laura the tracks of the wild creatures in the snow, and at the sides of the road, the small leaping tracks of a cottontail rabbit, the tiny tracks of a field mice, and the feather-stitching tracks of snowbirds. There were larger tracks like dogs' tracks, where foxes had run, and there were tracks of a deer that had bounded away into the snow. The air was growing warmer already, and Pa said that the snow wouldn't last long. It did not seem long until they were sweeping into the clearing at Grandpa's house. All the sleigh bells jingling, Grandma came to the door and stood there smiling, calling to them to come in. She said that Grandpa and Uncle George were already at work out in the maple woods, so Pa went to help them, while Laura and Mary and Ma, with baby Carrie in her arms, went into Grandma's house and took off their wraps. Laura loved Grandma's house. It was much larger than their house at home. There was one great big room, and then there was a little room that belonged to Uncle George, and there was another room for the aunts, Aunt Dosha and Aunt Ruby, and then there was the kitchen with the big cook stove. It was fun to run the whole length of the big room, from the large fireplace at one end all the way to Grandma's bed under the window in the other end. The floor was made of wide, thick slabs that Grandpa had hewed from the logs with his axe. The floor was smoothed all over and was scrubbed clean and white, and the big bed under the window was soft with feathers. The day seemed very short while Laura and Mary played in the big room, and Ma helped Grandma and the aunts in the kitchen. The men had taken their dinners to the maple woods, so for dinner they did not set the table, but ate cold venison sandwiches and drank milk. But for supper, Grandma made hasty pudding. She stood by the stove, sifting the yellow cornmeal from her fingers into a kettle of boiling salted water. She stirred the water all the time with a big wooden spoon and sifted the meal until the kettle was full of a thick yellow bubbling mass. And then she set it on the back of the stove where it would cook slowly. It smelled good. The whole house smelled good, with the sweet and spicy smells from the kitchen and the smell of the hickory logs burning with clear, bright flames in the fireplace, and the smell of a clove apple pomander beside Grandma's mending basket on the table. The sunshine came in through the sparkling window panes, and everything was large and spacious and clean. At supper time, Pa and Grandpa came from the woods. Each had on his shoulders a wooden yoke that Grandpa had made. It was cut to fit around their necks in the back and hollowed out to fit over their shoulders. From each end hung a chain with a hook, and on each hook hung a big wooden bucket full of hot maple syrup. Pa and Grandpa had brought the syrup from the big kettle in the woods. They steadied the buckets with their hands, but the weight hung from the yokes on their shoulders. There you go. The yoke is the thing on top of their necks, like an ox would take a cow. Like the yoke would take the oxen. Oh man, Miss Heather. Grandma made room for a huge brass kettle on the stove. Pa and Grandpa poured the syrup into the brass kettle, and it was so large that it held all the syrup from the 4 big buckets. Then Uncle George came with a smaller bucket of syrup, and everybody ate the hot, hasty pudding with maple syrup for supper. Uncle George was home from the army. He wore his blue army coat with brass buttons, and he had bold, merry blue eyes. He was big and broad, and he walked with a swagger. He walked cool. Laura looked at him all the time she was eating her hasty pudding, because she had heard Pa say to Ma that he was wild. "George is wild since he came back from the war," Pa had said, shaking his head as if he were sorry, but it couldn't be helped. Uncle George had run away to be a drummer boy in the army, and he was 14 years old. Laura had never seen a wild man before. She did not know whether she was afraid of Uncle George or not. When supper was over, Uncle George went outside the door and blew his army bugle long and loud. It made a lovely ringing sound far away through the big woods. The woods were dark and silent, and the trees stood still as though they were listening. Then from far away the sound came back, thin and clear and small, like a little bugle answering the big one. "Listen," Uncle George said. "Isn't that pretty?" Laura looked at him, but she did not say anything, and when Uncle George stopped blowing the bugle, she ran into the house. Ma and Grandma cleared away the dishes and washed them and swept the hearth, while Aunt Dosha and Aunt Ruby made themselves pretty in their room. Laura sat on their bed and watched them comb out their long hair and part it carefully. They parted it from their foreheads to the napes of their necks, and then they parted it across from their ear to the other ear. They braided their hair in the back in long braids, and they did the braids up carefully in big knots. Let me show you that. Here they are, carefully fixing their hair. They had washed their hands and faces and scrubbed them well with soap at the wash basin on the bench in the kitchen. They had used store soap, not the slimy, soft, dark brown soap that Grandma made and kept in a big jar to use for common every day. They fussed for a long time with their front hair, holding up the lamp and looking at their hair in the little looking glass that hung on the log wall. They brushed it smooth on each side of the straight white part, that it shone like silk in the lamplight. The little puff on each side shone too, and the ends were coiled and twisted neatly under the big knot in the back. Then they pulled on their beautiful white stockings, that had knit of fine cotton thread and lacy openwork patterns, and they buttoned up their best shoes. They helped each other with their corsets. Aunt Dosha pulled as hard as she could on Aunt Ruby's corset strings, and when Aunt Dosha hung on to the foot of the bed while Aunt Ruby pulled. So pull, Ruby, pull! Aunt Dosha said, breathless. Pull harder! So Aunt Ruby braced her feet and pulled harder on the strings of the corset. Aunt Dosha kept measuring her waist with her hands, and at last she gasped, I guess that's the best you can do. She said, Caroline says Charles could span her waist with his hands when they were married. That means she was so skinny in her corset, her pa could put his hands around her waist like that. That's really skinny. All right. Caroline was Laura's ma, and when she heard this, Laura felt proud. Then Aunt Ruby and Aunt Dosha put on their flannel petticoats, and then their plain petticoats, and then their stiff petticoats, and then their starched white petticoats with knitted lace all around the flounces. And they put on their beautiful dresses. Aunt Dosha's dress was a sprigged print, dark blue, with sprigs of red flowers and green leaves thick upon it. The basque was buttoned down the front with black buttons, which looked so exactly like juicy big blackberries that Laura wanted to taste them. Aunt Ruby's dress was wine-colored calico, covered all over with a feathery pattern in lighter wine color. It buttoned with gold-colored buttons, and every button had a little castle and a tree carved on it. Aunt Docia's pretty white collar was fastened in front with a large round cameo pin, which had a lady's head on it. But Aunt Ruby pinned her collar with a red rose made of sealed wax. She had made it herself on the head of a darning needle which had a broken eye, so it couldn't be used as a needle anymore. They looked lovely, sailing over the floor so smoothly with their large round skirts. Their little waists rose up tight and slender in the middle, and their cheeks were red and their eyes bright under the wings of shining, sleek hair. Ma was beautiful too, in her dark green delaine, with the little leaves that looked like strawberries scattered over it. The skirt was ruffled and flounced and draped and trimmed with knots of dark green ribbon, and nestling at her throat was a gold pin. The pin was flat, as long and as wide as Laura's two biggest fingers, and it was carved all over and scalloped on the edges. Ma looked so rich and fine that Laura was afraid to touch her. People had begun to come. They were coming on foot through the snowy woods with their lanterns, and they were driving up to the door in sleds and wagons. Sleigh bells were jingling all the time. The big room filled with tall boots and swishing skirts, and ever so many babies were lying in rows on Grandma's bed. Uncle James and Aunt Libby had come with their little girl, whose name was also Laura Ingalls. The two Lauras leaned on the bed and looked at the babies, and the other Laura said her baby was prettier than baby Carrie. "She is not," Laura said. "Carrie's the prettiest baby in the whole world." "No, she isn't," the other Laura said. "Yes, she is." "No, she isn't." Ma came sailing over in her fine delaine and said severely, "Laura!" So neither Laura said anything more. Uncle George was blowing his bugle. It made a loud ringing sound in the big room, and Uncle George joked and laughed and danced, blowing the bugle. Then Pa took his fiddle out of the box and began to play. There's Uncle George and his bugle. All right, and that's where we're going to leave off today. So we're just getting started with the party. All right, so don't forget about your 4 notes, and you don't have to draw your picture today because we're not done with Chapter 8. All right, and the vocab words will be in the description box. All right, love you guys. I'll see you later. See you at the next one.